All right, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we are going to be looking into something pretty crucial, I think, especially for our listeners. We're going to be talking about how we think about apostolic ministry today in the 21st century. And this isn't just some theoretical stuff. We are going to be looking at how the world has changed and how those changes are affecting those working, in different cultures around the globe. And the really interesting thing is that all of this is coming straight from stuff that you, the listeners, sent to us.
That's right. Listeners like you brought up some really big shifts that happened after things like, 9/11, and we're really interested in figuring out how those fast global changes, well, they're changing the whole scene for people working cross-culturally. And a lot of that work, of course, is within Muslim context. And the material you guys gave us really gets at the core of all that.
Yeah, and you know what else is interesting? The sources you sent point out three, I guess you could call them global trends that are basically reshaping the world as we know it, terrorism, globalization, and pluralism. And these aren't just, fancy words academics like to throw around. I mean, these things are really affecting how we communicate, how we think, what we do, especially if you're trying to navigate, different cultures.
And just to help us really zero in on this whole discussion, the author of one of these sources decided to use the term apostolic ministry instead of just using the more general term missions. Their definition of an apostle here is somebody who is intentionally sent to start communities of Jesus followers in places where, well, Christ isn't known. And this distinction really helps us see the specific problems and opportunities that we're talking about. What do you think about that? Why do you think the author made this definition of apostle so important to their point?
Oh, that's a good question. I think maybe by focusing on that pioneer aspect and the goal of starting new communities, the author is separating this kind of work from just general, charity work or social aid, even if those things are also happening, right? It really puts the emphasis on, trying to have a spiritual impact in places where the gospel hasn't reached. But okay, let's dig into this more. Let's start with terrorism and how it affected everything after 9/11. I mean, it's almost impossible to overstate how much that one event changed the way the world sees things.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Before 9/11, those who worked among Muslim communities, they kind of did their thing without a lot of attention from the public.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, everything changed, and they were in the spotlight. People started looking at them in this really black and white way. Either they were like these super important bridge builders between cultures, helping everyone get along, or they were seen as like potential troublemakers, putting everyone at risk. And this forced people into these stories that weren't true, that they didn't want to be a part of. And it was a challenge that, well, it just wasn't really there before.
And, with everybody suddenly interested and the media paying attention, it led to some pretty unexpected and complicated problems. The source we were talking about gives this really good example about a church in Australia. They were trying to put on a seminar to help people understand and love Muslims.
What's really interesting about this is that during the seminar, they read some verses from the Quran, the ones about how women and non-believers should be treated. And again, their whole goal was to start a conversation and to help people understand. But what happened? Some Australian converts to Islam who were at the seminar, they filed a hate speech lawsuit. Yeah. And in the end, you know what? The pastors were actually convicted of vilifying Islam.
That's pretty crazy. So what do you think this tells us about how open we can really be when we're trying to talk about different faiths these days?
Well, I think it shows just how sensitive everything is right now. Even if you're really trying to be understanding and learn about another faith, things can easily be misunderstood. It can even get you in trouble. It makes you wonder, how can people even have an open and honest conversation about religion in a climate like this? The source also has this other story, almost a warning, about a leader of, a faith-based organization. Yeah, right. And this leader, he decided to let a freelance journalist sit in on one of his classes at the seminary. Well, the journalist wrote a really negative and kind of sensational article about it. But what's really important here is how quickly that article spread all over the Muslim world. I mean, it was translated and reprinted like crazy, way more than anyone expected.
And it caused some serious problems, didn't it?
Yeah.
This totally unexpected bad publicity, even possible invitations to go on major news channels, it caught the leader completely off guard. And to make matters worse, because of the article, this NGO working in a very sensitive Islamic country was suddenly linked to his organization in a negative way. I mean, this could have really messed up their work and even put their people in danger. It just shows how little control we have over our own stories in a world where everyone's connected. connector.
You're right. The internet has completely changed how fast information spreads and how many
Ah.
people it reaches. It's kind of a different story, but there's also that one about the family who was surveyed in a Muslim majority country.
Oh, right, right. They came home and there was this church event specifically for international students. And, someone from the church's missions committee was super excited and introduced them to students from the country where they'd been working. But get this, they said something like, "These are our missionaries to your country."
And that statement, even though it seemed innocent, it really highlights how tough it is to keep your different identities separate in our globalized world. When everyone's so connected, it's hard to keep the labels and groups you belong to in their own little boxes. And that can lead to, well, awkward situations and even risky ones, especially for those involved in cross-cultural service. I mean, it shows how different the way someone's seen and presented by their own culture can be from their actual role in the culture they're serving.
And all of that brings us to the second big trend we were talking about. Globalization, or as the source put it, Google-proof transparency. I mean, that phrase really makes you think, doesn't it? What makes this transparency so important?
Well, I think the internet, things like Google, have made it so that information, once it's out there, can be found by anyone in the world almost instantly. And this kind of transparency, well, it just didn't exist before. It means that even the things you think are private, like groups you're part of or things you do, can become public really fast. And that makes it hard to keep those different identities separate.
And this has a real impact on people working across cultures, doesn't it? It can be really challenging. The story about Elmac is a good example of that.
Yeah, it really is. So Elmac, he's teaching at a university in a country where, it's not easy to be a Christian. And one day, a friend of his who wasn't a Christian told him that some other friends thought he and his wife were missionaries. But what's interesting is why she didn't think they were missionaries. She said, you can't be missionaries because you love God and love people. What do you think that says about how people there see the word missionary?
It makes you wonder if maybe missionary has a negative meaning to them, like it's not about caring for people, Like maybe there's some hidden agenda. And you know what Elmac did? He did what we'd all probably do. He Googled himself.
And what he found was pretty surprising. He saw himself labeled as a missionary in several places online. One time was in a teenager's online diary after he'd spoken at a church event back home, and another time it was on the website of a church, a well-meaning church, where he'd given a presentation years before.
Yeah, and for Elmac, the worry wasn't just about his job in that sensitive environment. It was something deeper. He was worried that this label could hurt his relationships with his friends, students, and colleagues who weren't Christians, Would they still want to connect with him and be open, or would they start to be suspicious and pull away?
Exactly, and it just shows how easily our identities can be shaped and spread online, sometimes without us even knowing or wanting it. And that can really hurt our credibility in the message we're trying to share. It's like the source says, this Google-proof transparency makes it almost impossible to keep those separate identities going.
So if it's so difficult to maintain those dual identities or those bivocational identities in this transparent world, what does the source suggest we do instead? It seems to focus on singularizing your identity.
Right. So instead of trying to keep your different identities separate, being one thing for your sending church and another thing in the culture you're serving, the idea is to build your sense of self around your core job, passion, or purpose. That's true, and the same in every situation. Like the examples they give, Christ-centered educator or businessman. The goal is to let Christ shine through the quality of your work and the integrity of your life. And that builds trust with everyone, no matter who they are.
And that brings us to the third major trend, navigating pluralism. It's complicated, right? The source talks about the challenge of keeping a true identity with a triple audience. What does that mean, this triple audience?
Well, in today's world, everyone's connected, and there's so much diversity, right?
Yeah.
So people working cross-culturally often find themselves talking to 3 different groups at the same time. First, there are the people they're trying to reach with the gospel. Then there's the wider world, the people who aren't religious, who are watching and maybe judging their actions and motivations. And lastly, there's their own churches and supporters back home. The tricky part is that anything you say or do, any information you share for one group, can easily be seen and interpreted by the other 2. And sometimes that leads to consequences you didn't expect.
It's like trying to have 3 separate conversations at the same time, but they all have to be important, and they're all happening in the same room. How do you even begin to figure out how to communicate in that kind of environment? The source says there are 3 key questions to ask yourself.
That's right. The author says that to handle this complicated situation, we need to really think and pray about these 3 things. First, how will we present our message so that it makes sense to each of those groups? Second, how will we be honest and real about our intentions? And third, how will we present our true selves in a way that keeps our integrity and builds trust with all three groups?
So let's focus on that first question, shaping the message. The source introduces this idea of a core message. What makes this core message different from, say, specific ways of talking about faith that might be tailored for a specific culture?
Okay, so the core message, as the author puts it, is the essential, can't be reduced gospel message. It's the basic truth of the Christian faith that should resonate with everyone, those who haven't heard the gospel, the secular world, and the sending church. Now, of course, the specific ways you communicate and apply this core message will change depending on the culture, right? You want to make it relevant and understandable to each group. But those different expressions, they always have to stay true to and be consistent with that central unifying message.
And how do you even figure out what that core message is for yourself? The source asks a really deep, maybe even uncomfortable question that makes you think.
It does. The author tells us to ask ourselves, what message am I willing to die for? And this isn't about getting lost in little details of theology or side arguments. It's about figuring out the absolute non-negotiable center of what we believe. And the author shares their own thoughts on this, saying that they wouldn't die for a specific missions agency or a certain country's foreign policy. But by God's grace, they would be willing to die for Christ and for the right of every person to know and experience his love.
It's like it strips away all the extra stuff and helps you focus on what really matters, you know?
Yeah.
It's about putting the heart of the gospel first, above everything else. The source also mentions how important it is to be careful about the language we use when we talk about our work and that we shouldn't rely too much on certain metaphors.
Yeah, the author points out that historically the missions movement has used a lot of military metaphors and slogans that sound like you're going to conquer something. Now, maybe those were meant to inspire people and make people see the people being served in a negative light, like they're targets that need to be overtaken or like they're somehow less than.
It's a good reminder that the words we choose can shape how we see things and that we can even dehumanize others without realizing it. So if those traditional words and metaphors might be a problem, what does the source suggest as a better way to describe our calling to be apostolic?
The author suggests using the idea of blessing the nations from the Bible. They say it's a better way to describe our main mission because it's more holistic and more true to the Bible. This idea comes from God's promise to Abraham in the book of Genesis, where God says that through Abraham, all nations will be blessed.
And the idea of blessing feels much more positive, doesn't it? It's not just about a narrow view of spiritual change.
Exactly. Throughout the Old Testament, blessing includes both God's grace and favor, which is the relational side of being right with him, and his actual power and provision. It leads to wholeness, well-being, peace, and of course, salvation. It affects both our relationship with God and our everyday lives.
And the source makes it clear that this Old Testament promise of blessing is connected to Jesus Christ.
Oh, absolutely. That promise finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. The Apostle Paul talks about this in his letter to the Galatians, emphasizing that both the reconciliation with God and the power of his blessing are now available through faith in Christ. The author argues that our core message, the good news of the blessing we find in Jesus, is perfectly aligned with our mission to take this blessing to all nations. It's like Paul says in Galatians 3:8, the gospel was announced to Abraham beforehand.
I like that reframing. Instead of using language that sounds aggressive or militaristic, we talk about bringing blessing. It feels more like a posture of service and love, doesn't it? So, moving on to the third important question. How do we present ourselves, our identities, in this complex world? The source points out that people who are doing apostolic work face some real challenges when it comes to how they see themselves and how others see them.
Yeah, a big challenge is try to maintain those dual identities we talked about before. You're seen as a missionary by your supporting churches, but you're working under a different title, like business consultant or aid worker in the culture you're serving. And in our globally connected world, that balancing act is getting harder and harder.
That example of the two American women who were kidnapped in Afghanistan in 2001, that really shows what can happen when those different layers of identity clash, doesn't it?
It does. When they were released, they were always referred to as aid workers. But almost immediately, the media around the world started showing a prayer card that very clearly labeled them as missionaries. That dual identity they might have been trying to maintain just vanished under all that public attention.
And The source says that this pressure to keep up those dual identities can have some pretty negative consequences for the people doing this kind of work.
It can, yeah. It can lead to constant anxiety and a feeling like you're not being authentic, even dishonest. And over time, it can make you less confident and bold about sharing your faith. You can feel like you're living a divided life where your spiritual motivation is separate from your work and how you interact with people every day.
So, if trying to juggle those dual identities is so difficult, what does the source suggest instead? They seem to focus on the idea of an integrated identity. What does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, an integrated identity means bringing together your deepest motivations, your practical job, the author calls tent making, your spiritual gifts, and your overall apostolic calling into one unified sense of self. So instead of thinking I'm a business person who also happens to be a missionary, the integrated perspective is I'm a business apostle, using my skills for God's glory and his kingdom. Your core identity stays the same no matter who you're talking to.
So, it's about living and working with integrity, where your everyday actions line up with your ultimate purpose. But the source reminds us that integrity needs to be balanced with wisdom and discretion.
Absolutely. Having integrity doesn't mean you have to tell everyone everything about yourself and what you're doing. The Force mentions what Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 10:16, to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You need to be real about who you are, but you also need to be smart about how and when you share certain things, especially in situations that are sensitive.
That story about Bob Blinko working in Kurdistan, that's a really good example of how this balance between openness and wisdom can work, isn't it?
It is, even though they were in a place that could be dangerous. Being open about their identity as followers and servants of Jesus actually earned them the trust and protection of the local Kurdish community. And that was a big part of why the church there was able to grow. You know, that phrase from the Bible, as unknown yet well known, from 2 Corinthians 6:4 and 9, it describes this really well. They were unknown to the people who might want to hurt them, but they were known and trusted by the people they were serving.
And the source also mentions some things that can get in the way of developing that kind of integrated identity. What are some of those common roadblocks?
Well, there are a few things. Sometimes people hold on to old ways of thinking about missions, where they separate spiritual work from secular work. Or maybe they have a view of the Christian life that doesn't really bring faith into all parts of life. Sometimes people don't understand tent making correctly, or they haven't been trained well enough to deal with the complexities of engaging with different cultures today.
So it sounds like if we really want to adapt to the 21st century, it's not enough to just change our methods or the words we use. We need a much deeper change in who we are, how we see ourselves.
Exactly. The source concludes by saying that this adaptation requires a real change in being, not just wording or how we do things. We might need to rethink and restructure how we approach apostolic work in this world that's changing so fast.
So just to sum up, we've looked at how the world has changed after 9/11, how globalization has made everything transparent, and how hard it is to navigate pluralism. All of these things together have created a whole new environment for cross-cultural ministry. And this new reality means we have to rethink how we understand and explain our core identity and how we approach our work.
And a key part of this is developing a core message that's based on this big positive idea of blessing the nations. And we also need to cultivate a core identity that's marked by real integrity and that genuinely connects with all the different people we encounter in this world where we're all so connected.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive, and it leaves us with a big question for you, our listeners, to think about even after we're done here. In this world that's becoming more and more interconnected and complex, how can you and the organizations you're a part of really live out your core values and purpose in a way that truly helps people understand each other, builds trust, and makes a positive difference across different cultures and perspectives? What does blessing the nations actually look like in your own life, in the areas where you have influence? And how can the insights we've explored today help you as you do that? We really encourage you to keep thinking about these concepts, considering your own situation and the key things we've talked about today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.